Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Tutorial video we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with AMD, specifically 7nm Vega and 7nm EPYC. It has been confirmed by AMD that we will actually be seeing 7nm Vega launch by the end of this year, with the company targeting December at the latest. But furthermore, the company have confirmed it is not simply going to be a die shrink of the current Vega 10 architecture. Instead, there are going to be several inner workings that the company have tweaked and combine that with additional memory bandwidth and up to 32 GB of HBM2 memory. AMD confirmed though that we will not be seeing 7nm Vega for gaming. Instead, these will be for the Radeon Pro market as well as Radeon Instinct. So instead of Vega 7nm, AMD will be competing with Nvidia with their Navi chipset, which, don't forget, is scheduled to launch next year. Now, there are an awful lot of rumours concerning what Navi is and is not, but the main rumours are that this GPU has been used for Sony's PlayStation 5 as well. Unfortunately, details about performance are, well, thin on the ground. The only reports we have had is that the GPU will be targeting the mid-range, much like Polaris, and so AMD are planning to bring mid-range performance down in price, much like, let's say, the 400 series did when they did release it. So that means performance for a card which will put out roughly the levels of performance of, let's say, a GTX 1080 or a Vega 64 will come down to price, let's say $200 to $250 US, which would be awesome. The problem is, if you were to look at a card like, let's say, the RTX 2080, it will have no competition from AMD, at least for now. And now let's move over to GeForce 20 news with the RTX 2080, 2070 and 2080 Ti. It's fair to say that when Jensen Huang took to stage at Computex, there was an awful lot of questions answered. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, there was just as many questions raised, perhaps more so. And given the price points of these cards, which is up to $1,000 US or more, actually, if you're looking at the Founders Edition for the 2080 Ti, having this number of questions when pre-orders are open is not necessarily a good thing. But fortunately, there have been a couple of reports since which are starting to shed some light on the performance and the type of features that these cards will offer. Now, actually, I wrote a rather large script for a video that I was going to put out today. Unfortunately, for me anyway, because so much information has actually been released since, I've decided to hold off on that video and probably rewrite the script when a little more information is available, because otherwise it would just have been out of date by now. But let's discuss what we have actually learned. So first of all, Amy did report this, but I'm going to quickly go over it just for those who missed it. You can check her video out yesterday, but essentially, there was a report that Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p was not able to maintain 60 FPS with ray tracing turned on. But, as she rightly pointed out, the problem is that the software itself, as in the SDKs, the game design itself, as in the actual implementation, as well as the drivers for the GeForce graphics cards, are still really early. And rather large performance increases are not uncommon. If you were the early adopter of Ryzen, you'll have noticed that back in the day there was a massive performance uptick with certain applications when games developers, for example, released patches. Actually, the Singularity was one such example. BIOS updates were another such example, as well as Windows itself. In fact, regular viewers, if you've been around for a while, over a year, you'll know this, but if not, you can find a link actually on the channel. But I actually had to redo a good series of benchmarks for a motherboard that we were reviewing at the time with an 1800X. It was an X370 motherboard. And the reason behind that was shortly after I actually got the motherboard through, there was like a BIOS update that reset all of my results. Then there was an update for actually the Singularity and Rise of the Tomb Raider, and on top of that as well, then Windows released an update, and it basically just scuppered all the results we had. So these type of things can drastically affect the performance of software. Now, my personal opinion, that does not necessarily mean you shouldn't be concerned, and I certainly don't think that turning on ray tracing is going to suddenly make the game run at, like, you know, just a few % lower performance compared to having it off, but still it's worth noting. By far though, one of the biggest concerns people have had is what is the performance level of these GPUs with ray tracing disabled with the same graphical settings compared to the previous generation. So, for sake of argument, let's say you've got Crysis 3 running at 4K with all the settings at maxed on a 1080 Ti. It scores X frame rate. What frame rate does the 2080 Ti score? And that is a really, really good question. After all, if you're not interested in ray tracing or you're playing older games, you might just want to know, well, what performance uptick are you going to be getting? And there have been a lot of folks who have said, well, Nvidia not showing performance results of that type of testing at their conferences. And bear in mind, if you saw the Pascal conference, one of the things that Jensen Huang was very, very confident about, he mentioned it so many times of the miracles of Pascal on how the clock speed had ramped up and the memory bandwidth had gone through the stratosphere, and how the performance was absolutely just ballistic with the 1080s just destroying the 980s. You remember that, right? It was so common, and how he was so happy to announce that the 1070 actually outperformed the Titans of the previous generation. He was so happy to announce that. And there was not that type of buzz here. Instead, it was really focused on ray tracing. And so some people were saying, well, gee, does that mean that it's only going to be, what, a 20%, 30% improvement over the previous generation? That may not be the case. There's actually multiple reports starting to come in. One from the website TechRadar, I'll link it in the video description, along with actually an article of all the stuff I'm covering here, plus some other thoughts as well. And TechRadar report that they were testing multiple games at 4K with all the settings at max, so all of the settings set to ultra, and they were hitting over 100 frames a second with the RTX 2080 Ti. And at the worst, they were hitting, the high 60s. Bear in mind that the drivers are still not in the finalized state yet, and to make matters worse, they said that the setup that Nvidia had was about the worst setup you could possibly have. In essence, you had like the front of the PC here, and the back of a PC here, and then another front of a PC here. So in other words, the heat from this PC, from PC A, was being pushed to the intake fans of PC B. PC B? Haha. Computers, PC, oh god. And, yeah, so I'm not quite sure whose genius idea it was to set it up like that, because it was pretty much the worst scenario possible. Because obviously one of the things with GPUs is that, well, yeah, they boost according to the heat of the GPU itself, along with other things such as power and frame rate. For example, if you're getting like 200 frames a second and the GPU workload is like 15%, it doesn't really feel the need to crank the clocks up, right? But still, that is obviously most likely affecting A, the CPU performance, and B, the GPU performance of the machine. So it is rather interesting that TechRadar are reporting this. Now, Nvidia have actually released a set of benchmarks themselves which pit the RTX 2080 against the 1080. For those wondering, well, how does the 2070 or the 2080 Ti stack up? They have not released that information, so we can't understand how it's going to compare against its predecessors. But what we do have is a good understanding of a variety of different games: Mass Effect Andromeda, Battlefront 2, Far Cry 5, Battlefield 1, F1 2017, Resident Evil 7, Final Fantasy 15, and so on and so on. And according to Nvidia themselves, well, you can see, for example, Mass Effect Andromeda at 4K is now capable of playing at 67 FPS on average. If we were to look at Far Cry 5, 71 frames per second, Battlefield 1, 84 frames per second, Resident Evil 7, 66 frames per second, and Final Fantasy 15 just hit 60 FPS. I wonder how much they were sweating to get that exact. Of course, other than the resolution, what graphical settings were they choosing? Well, most likely, I'm going to assume the very highest quality settings. But the bigger question to me is, what areas of the game were they using? Were they using perhaps some of the less demanding areas of the game? Or were they using the areas that really push the GPU to its limits? The next set of results comes to us from a graph, which is the RTX 2080, which Nvidia are using a PR term here, which is 2 times the 1080. Now you can see there's 3 sets of results. There's the grey, which is the 1080, there's the darker green, which is the 2080, and then there's the lighter green, which is 2080 plus DLSS. Let's start with the non-DLSS at the start. Now the results here are, well, depending on the title. So, for example,
you could be looking at anything from, let's say, around the 30% mark to about 50% faster than the 1080. So, for example, we can say, and this is a very broad assessment, but we can say that the 2080 is roughly 40% faster with no specific Turing tweaks, no specific Turing functionality being used by the game than its predecessor. But if they were to take advantage of that by using the Tensor Core's ability to use AI, where it's using deep learning super sampling, performance goes up through the stratosphere. You can be looking at way over 2 times the performance compared to the previous generation. And Arc Survival, well, yeah, that's almost 2.5 times. It's around 2.23, maybe 2.3 times compared to the previous generation. So some games like Final Fantasy 15 will receive patches, of course, which will add this functionality in, which is obviously a really good thing for owners of this specific card. So this does lend a lot of extra credence to TechRadar's report that certain games will indeed be able to run at 100 FPS at 4K. I don't think it's going to be really graphically demanding titles, it might be older titles, but even so, the ability to play something like Far Cry 5 at way north of 60 FPS with a GTX, the RTX 2080 is really impressive. And do bear in mind that this is the RTX 2080, so it does significantly outperform the GTX 1080 Ti. So essentially it's going to be something like the RTX 2080, then it would be the 1080 Ti, then it would probably be the RTX 2070, then it would probably be the 1080. That is roughly how the pecking order seems to be going. And these kind of results are much closer to the Titan V actually than perhaps what even I was anticipating. Of course, the Titan V is not really a graphics card which was designed for games, but even so, the results are impressive. The problem is that for many people, if you look at the worst case scenarios, for example, PUBG or, I don't know, Hitman, then obviously the performance is pretty good, but yeah, it's still significantly more expensive than the previous generation. So the 2080 is way more expensive than the 1080 Ti. So that's definitely something that's going to remain in someone's mind and possibly spur them to try and get a 1080 Ti as the cards go end of life. Then again, if you've got the cash, and I realise that not everyone does, if you do have the cash and you can afford an RTX 2080 or even an RTX 2080 Ti, I mean, yeah, I can't even imagine the levels of performance of the RTX 2080 Ti. In theory, the 2080 Ti is a good 30-40% faster, so at least in theory anyway, we could be looking at frame rates way north of this, and that's definitely why I can definitely get behind the fact that the folks over at TechRadar were saying that a lot of games were running at 100 FPS. I mean, if you add, once again, 20 or 30 or even 40% performance that the Ti is going to have over the base model, then yeah, Far Cry 5 is definitely going to be running at like 100 FPS. Games like Mass Effect is probably going to be running over 100 FPS, and even if you were to take the worst performing title here, which is of course Final Fantasy 15, you can certainly see at the very least it's going to be getting the high 70 FPS mark, which is pretty damn impressive.
The bottom line is that that's probably a really good sign. And Nvidia themselves, in their blog, it's kind of buried actually under all of the Tensor Core talk, under all of the ray tracing talk. They have mentioned that there is definitely a major performance uptick compared to the previous generation. How much? Well, they've not specifically said, but they have pointed out that traditional titles will easily run at 4K 60 FPS. Of course, because no one's mentioning about the games here, it's possible that, for example, we're looking at, this is being a bit silly, but we could be looking at, you know, like Tomb Raider 2013. But more realistically, we're looking at more demanding titles, because otherwise, these websites and Nvidia themselves would not be so willing to point this out. Because if it was really old titles where it's very easy to get that type of frame rate, you know, it wouldn't make sense. My guess is it's games such as Doom. My guess is it's titles like Rise of the Tomb Raider, possibly. My guess is it's titles that actually are going to push the GPU. With that said, that does not necessarily equate to me suggesting you plonk down the money. The biggest issue I have with Nvidia's conference, other than the fact that we don't have performance data, was the fact that the cards are now on pre-order. In fact, some of their pre-orders have already sold out for these GPUs. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't like the pricing is one major problem I've got. I think they're really expensive. But the problem I have mostly is the fact that you're asking people to plonk down cash and they're not really sure what they're getting. And actually, as a slight aside, if you look at the specs of the cards, that is the 70, the 80, and the Ti, the actual 80 is closer this time to the 70 than what it is the Ti. This is actually different from the Pascal generation, where the Ti was closer to the 80 and the 70 was a little bit further behind. But if you look at the memory bandwidth, for example, they're pretty much identical between the 70 and the 80. The CUDA core count is closer, and so on and so on. So basically, there is a larger distinction between the 80 and the 80Ti or 80Ti or whatever you want to call it. So that's definitely something that I'm sure Nvidia did deliberately. With that said, there is an awful lot of exciting technology in these cards, and Nvidia themselves are really keen to push the RTX ops and all of this type of stuff. And don't get me wrong, I understand that they're trying to separate performance, but it does also mean that we have a number which at the moment no other architecture has. So I don't necessarily know if I agree with that number being used as marketing just yet. But at the same time, Nvidia are marketing this as like a technology of the future, so it kind of is what it is. The problem is, it's also confusing to a lot of people, because some people are like, well, okay, if you throw all that together then, the tensor cores are helping with like pixel stuff, right? No, that's not the case, of course. We all know that the tensor cores are for AI. The RT cores are for ray tracing. So, in essence, if you were to play a game like Metro 2033, because you're, going through the series while Metro Exodus is, going to be launched, well, it's doing nothing. The cores are literally sitting there doing bupkis. And obviously, they're not taking power, because I'm assuming Nvidia's architecture is more than sensible enough to say, oh, okay, well, they've got no workload. We're going to shut those off. But still, essentially, you have paid for technology which is not doing anything at that point. With that said, I don't think the tensor cores are going to just be limited to running deep learning algorithms for the ray tracing of games. If you actually look back on a couple of months ago, EA were conducting deep learning experiments with Battlefield 1. And one of the things they were doing was to create an AI-controlled player. Now, this AI, this deep learning, this neural network controlled player was going up against regular bots. We actually covered this back in the day. And how did it go? Well, it was pretty much like if you were to go up against the entire US Navy in a rowboat. Guess which one you were compared to... Guess which one the traditional bots were. That's right. They were the rowboats. And the deep learning controlled player was the entire US Navy. Obviously, they had no prayer. They were getting absolutely wrecked. And the reason that this is kind of interesting to me is because it leads to possibilities of what we could be seeing in the future of the GPU of these, tensor cores running deep learning algorithms and possibly improving AI in games. That's only a theory, though. That's certainly not been confirmed by Nvidia or anyone else. And the other problem with that, well, consoles don't have it. And neither does any GPU prior to the RTX series, and AMD's GPUs do not have this either. It's possible, though, they could do it in software, I suppose. So, we'll have to wait and see on that. But still, it's a tantalizing possibility of what we could be seeing in the future. And honestly, I would be surprised if in the long term, and by long term I mean not too distant future, especially given what we've already learned about AMD's next generation GPUs. I did do an analysis of that, by the way. But basically the Super SIMD architecture could certainly have some of the functionality we're looking at here, not exactly. And there are some other reports that they're working on some additional stuff on their GPUs. Basically speaking, AMD have a lot of stuff in the pipeline. It's just, it's not really helpful to us right now. And exactly what their plans are and release schedule just doesn't mean anything right now, because Nvidia pretty much have the entire market to themselves in terms of gaming. Oh, and also I want to quickly add this to my thoughts as well regarding 7nm. I'm pretty sure we will see 7nm variant of this architecture, but whether it will be Turing or a larger refresh, who knows? But my sneaking suspicion is it won't happen yet. AMD just are not providing enough competition for Nvidia to do that. Nvidia are probably going to release the RTX 2080 Ti, the 2080, the 2070, and then of course they're going to fill out the rest of the product lineup like the 2060s, the 2050s, and so on and so on. And eventually, and then of course they'll also be launching the mobile parts, and then eventually after that we'll start seeing the 7nm cards become quite consistent in the professional market, like server type of things. And then I reckon by end of next year we'll probably start seeing 7nm GeForces start popping onto the store shelves. And it wouldn't surprise me in the least if those happen to be PCIe 4.0, because additional memory bandwidth will probably be quite important at that point anyway. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video and also enjoyed some of my ramblings and thoughts here. With all of that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.